So a very good evening to everyone. It's a great pleasure to start this second academic forum dedicated to the future of the European Union. I would like to mention that this academic forum takes place within our research project dedicated to the integral theory of the future of the European Union. It is a timely initiative, especially since, I believe today, the European Council is taking place in Brussels, and they will be also picking up the so-called non-paper, the proposal, the initiative by the French and the German government to start a new debate, a new conference on the future of Europe. Against that background, we wanted to seize this opportunity to celebrate another anniversary. This year is a year of anniversaries. We just celebrated with our journal, human rights journal Dignitas, we just celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. And since the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union is part and parcel of the Treaty of Lisbon, that also means the Treaty of Lisbon is celebrating its 10th anniversary. And today, I invited our three speakers. Her Excellence, first of all, Florence Ferrari, who is Madam Ambassador of the Republic of France to Slovenia. Then we have Ula Hudina Kmetic, who is acting head of the European Commission in Slovenia. Deputy head. And Ms. Katarina Vatovec, who is an assistant professor of European law here at our new university. And I invited the speakers to reflect upon the history of the Treaty of Lisbon, to remind ourselves how was it that the Treaty of Lisbon actually came into being. Those were no easy times, as you would remember. It was after the Denkpause, after the period of reflection, when, because of the French, a little bit, the European Union was tossed into a constitutional... There were also the Dutch. This time around, they weren't the Brits, because the French, in a way, saved them. So the treaty of the constitutional treaty failed. It wasn't approved by the people in France and neither in the Netherlands. So the European Union had to reflect already on its future at that time and to find a way out of that constitutional crisis. The leaders decided to drop the constitutional terminology and they opted for a new treaty. It was called a reform treaty, but since it was signed in Lisbon, it's nowadays understood and widely believed to be a Treaty of Lisbon. So I want to debate a little bit the coming into being of the Treaty of Lisbon, the way the Treaty of Lisbon performed over the last 10 not really easy years. We've been struck by many crises. And in light of the developments that follow, I would also like to raise a question whether the Treaty of Lisbon today still presents an adequate legal framework for the functioning of the European Union, or is there maybe a need even for a treaty change that is a little bit at least hinted at also in this non-paper. I suggest we start in the following way. I would first invite my colleague to explain to us how she sees the development of the Treaty of Lisbon in the past and its achievements so far. Then I would hand the floor to the Madam Ambassador to present her views and the views of the French Republic. And finally, I would also like to hear from the guardian of the treaties, including this treaty, namely the Treaty of Lisbon, Ms. Hudina Kmetic. So, Katarina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Matej, for giving us the opportunity to discuss, I would say, the past, the present, and perhaps the future of the European Union, although we are enrolling in yet another debate on the future next year on the European Union. Now, I would perhaps start by saying that France, okay, it was not successfully, the referenda at France of the constitutional treaty was not successfully passed. However, the European Council at Nice and the Intergovernmental Conference at Nice back in the year 2000 started the debate about the future of Europe. And slightly after that, the European Council adopted the Lacan Declaration on the Future of the European Union, and it set some goals to think about. And one of the goals was to make the European Union more democratic, more efficient, and more transparent. And these are the goals that are with us still today. The European Union is still striving to sort of like fulfill these aspirations and these goals. Now, the Lisbon Treaty, unlike perhaps, though there really was not much difference in terms of the substance between the Constitutional Treaty and the then adopted Lisbon Treaty. However, the Lisbon Treaty only amended the two treaties that were already on which the European Union was founded, and this is the Treaty on the European Union and Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. So it only amended these treaties, but it did something important. It sort of like dismissed the European community, so we are no longer in terms of thinking whether we have a European community, European communities, or European Union. We have the European Union, which is based on two treaties. They have the same legal value. And the Lisbon Treaty also brought some institutional, perhaps constitutional changes that are important. And I will focus on these legal mechanisms, which brought in this decade, which was, as Matej said, very much challenging because of the economic and financial crisis, because of the refugee and migration crisis, because of the rule of law crisis, because of the, perhaps we can say, constitutional crisis in terms of what is going on with the Brexit. So these mechanisms that were important, and we know that the European Union was born out of a crisis, and it deepened its competencies and its activities out of crisis. Every crisis is a challenge for the European Union. And out of every crisis, the European Union comes not, I would say, weaker, but a bit fuller and with a bit enlarged competencies, so to speak. So the first mechanism I would like to point out as a semi-important one is a possibility to change the Lisbon Treaty or the treaties on the EU and on the functioning of the EU with a simplified procedure. The simplified procedure, which means we are not now talking about a constitutional method, conventional method, or intergovernmental conferences that normally take quite a long period, and the process of negotiation and ratification takes another step, and it's a long process, lengthy process. So we have this simplified revision procedure, which is meant to change the treaty on the functioning of the European Union, and this procedure was used in this past decade. It was used after the financial and economic crisis, and it was used to establish the stability mechanism for the member states that adopted euro. So we had this new article within the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU without having enrolled in the lengthy process of a conventional matter or intergovernmental conference in order to change the treaty text. Then another method I would like to point out is the mechanism of the enhanced cooperation, which was used several times in the past decade. And the last memorable thing dealing with the enhanced cooperation is the establishment of the European Public Prosecutor's Office, which means that national authorities are no longer the only ones dealing with the prosecution of fraud of EU budget, but this overstepped or stepped at the EU level, which is important. Then another mechanism I would like to stress, because the European Union constantly say, or we constantly say, the citizens, that the European Union has this huge democratic deficit. People are not close, they don't feel close, they don't feel sort of like together with the European Union. So what can we do about that? What can the European Union do about that? And the European Union, the Lisbon Treaty, adopted a European Citizens Initiative mechanism in order to, let's say, make the civil society more in line with the EU duties or the EU institutions. But then some argue that the European Union many times focus on the democratic deficit at the EU level, while it at the same time ignores the deficit or perhaps the problematic rule of law procedures at the level of member states. And within this past decade, the European Union or the European Commission for the first time asked the Council to establish that one of the member states is, let's say, severely breaching the values on which the European Union is founded, the rule of law, democracy, one of them. So this was also something that happened in the past decade. And then, of course, what Matej mentioned, I have to stress again, because I have the opportunity to show you our last edition of the journal Dignitas, which is the journal published by Nova Univerza and a journal dedicated to human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this last number of this journal was dedicated to the EU Charter, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which, as Matej said, together with the Lisbon Treaty, became a, let's say, legal mechanism with the entrance into force of the Lisbon Treaty. Before that, it was only a symbolic declaration, let's say. Now it has the same legal value as the treaties, so it's the part of the primary law, and it's therefore much more important in terms of us, the citizens, but also in terms of the courts, not only the Court of Justice of the European Union, but also national courts. Now the EU Charter therefore has become a official, formal legal document used by, as I said, national courts and the European Court of Justice, and it's therefore important for all us to know its substance, to know how it's used, how we can use it in courts, let's say. Of course, the Lisbon Treaty made another substantial, let's say, positive point, which is the possibility of the EU, though it's not written as a possibility, it's written as an obligation, for the European Union to accede to the European Convention of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. But I think if we talk about the past and the present and the future, this does not encompass the European Union becoming part of the European Convention, because I reckon it will not be so for a long period of time, depending on the situation that is going on now. So these, I would say, are some of the core mechanisms, legal mechanisms, that were put in the Lisbon Treaty in order to make perhaps some changes in political environment. And they were used in the past decade, and they will, I think their use will start to, in a way, to prove whether the Lisbon Treaty in that regard fulfilled the aspirations I talked about before to be more democratic, more transparent, and more effective. So,
thank you very much. Thank you very much, Katarina, for pinpointing to the main contributions of the Treaty of Lisbon to the valid legal order of the European Union. I have made some notes and I will comment on what you've said a little bit later, but my impression is that if you are asked whether there is a need to change, to amend the Treaty of Lisbon, in the undertone, I feel that you are in fact arguing that to the contrary, that not even all the possibilities offered by the Treaty of Lisbon have been exhausted yet. But I might be wrong. I'm turning now to you, Madam Ambassador, to hear your view on the achievements, perhaps disappointment with the Treaty of Lisbon in the last 10 years, and what do you think might follow, also in the light of the new conference on the future of Europe?
Thank you very much, and first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's the first time I'm here, and I'm very glad to participate to this panel, and this because I have a long-standing interest in European issues since I have been working more than 10 years both in Brussels and Paris and also in Bonn on these subjects, including at the time of the Lisbon Treaty negotiation. I was in Brussels at that time. So after that, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a diplomat, so it will be the point of view of a diplomat serving a country which president is very active on these subjects. So I think you mentioned it very rightly. The topic on the agenda today is really accurate because of the 10th anniversary of the Lisbon Treaty, and also because of the Conference of Europe is one of the main points on the agenda of the new commissioner, Madame van der Leyen, and it was also an idea, one of the ideas of President Macron, and it fully echoes the discussions that led to the Lisbon Treaty 10 years or 12 years ago: more democracy, you mentioned it, and more efficiency in the functioning of the EU. So first point is okay, Lisbon, what were the objectives and what were the realities? And here I would really echo, I had the impression you were reading my expose. The first point is indeed to recall that the Lisbon Treaty was in a sort of second best, since it was born out of the failure of the treaty establishing a constitution for Europe. And we remember, we especially in France, the negative outcome of the referendum. I was at that time at the Prime Minister's office dealing with the EU matters, and it was really a kind of earthquake in our office. But, well, at the end, the simplified treaty, the Lisbon Treaty adopted in 2007, is nevertheless the same result of this dual desire expressed in the Lacan Declaration you mentioned, to make the Union more democratic and more efficient. And for this, the treaty has introduced a few institutional reforms. You mentioned the most important. They are in two blocks: efficiency on one hand and democracy on the second one. So when it comes to efficiency, there is indeed the legal personality of the EU, the simplification of the EU decision-making process in the Council, in particular when it comes to qualified majority voting. There is also the permanent presidency of the Council, the High Representative for European Foreign Policy, and some others. With regard to democracy, you also mentioned it, there is the strengthening of the role of national parliaments. I think it's important with the subsidiarity, the possibility of an initiative, citizens' initiative, the legal force of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And it's also the Lisbon Treaty which for the first time provides for an exit clause to the EU.
That's right.
And in a sense, it's also part of
the original sin.
Yeah. So has the Lisbon Treaty met expectation? You mentioned it very rightly. As soon as the treaty entered into force, the EU was confronted to a series of crises. I think President Juncker says it's polycrisis, starting with the crisis in the Eurozone in 2009, then the refugee crisis in 2015, finally the Brexit, which is also a crisis, and not to mention, and this is really key, the crisis of legitimacy through the rise of populist and Eurosceptic movements. So how has the EU, with the Lisbon Treaty, reacted to these different crises? I think we have to be a bit optimistic, because it has to be noted that, well, it has been able to overcome maybe not all crises, but in the sort that some of these crises, and in particular, maybe more the Euro crisis than the migration one, and we also found the kind of unity around Brexit. So the bilan is not that bad, I would say. The response to this crisis has been complicated and probably insufficient. We also have to be realistic, probably partly because of the institutional burden, and we have still not reformed the Schengen system, for instance, which is important for France, or agreed on a sustainable solidarity mechanism. So there is certainly a margin for improvement. And what is also very important is that some solutions even had to be found outside the treaties, outside the treaty. Even they had to be legitimized later. You mentioned the Euro crisis, and it's really how it happened. And this proves both the partly inadequacy of Lisbon, but also the flexibility of the EU. And I remember it was Enrico Letta in the Bled Strategic Forum who mentioned that, that we had to find somehow solutions outside the treaties. So in the end, whether this crisis or more generally, the Lisbon Treaty has shown that while it has shortcomings, it also allows great flexibility, and the Lisbon Treaty has proved to be a kind of toolbox that has not worked so badly in the end. Mm-hmm. So what now? Mm-hmm. What next? And especially in the context of the Conference of the Future of Europe. It's an idea that my president, again, had called for, namely in his March address, the Tribune aux citoyens européens for European renewal. And for him, it's a process that would involve civil society, and whose objective would be to define the kind of roadmap for the EU that translates key political priorities into concrete actions. It's a quotation. Mm-hmm. And the new head of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has made it one of the new Commission's projects, and we are very glad about it, even though it has narrowed its scope, focusing first on ways to further democratize the Union. So it's an ongoing process. The discussion on the method and the scope is still on the way. And today, indeed, at the European Council, it's one of the topics. It has been discussed at the General Affairs Council 2 days ago. And, well, we, France, recalled what is important for us, that all three institutions, Council, European Parliament and Commission, are involved at the same level in the discussion about the Conference for Europe, and that this conference should have three goals. The first is a better association of citizens to decision processes, for instance, through consultations. We experienced that in France, and also in the EU. This is something we should continue. The second goal is to reinforce the democratic functioning of the EU. This means election, designation of European leaders, Spitzenkandidaten, conflicts of interest, transparencies, all that scope of points. And the third goal for us is the reflection on policies, their content, and also the instruments to put in front of these policies in order to make the European action possible. So does it necessarily have to lead to reform of the treaties, because it's also a key point. In its address in March, the President Macron said, let's set up a conference for Europe in order to propose all the changes our political project needs without taboos, not even amending the treaties. So this means that for us, well, it's not excluded, but it's not the first one, because what is the most important for us, France, it's the political content, rather than any possible constitutional revisions. This is the strategic agenda that was adopted by the European Council last June and largely taken up by the new Commission. And these priorities, we are glad, largely echo what President Macron had expressed in his speech at La Sorbonne in September 2017. And he repeated it at the ambassadors' conference I attended last August. It means a Europe that responds to major environmental, economic, and political challenges. In other words, a Europe that ensures freedom, protection, and progress. That are the three. So this is what the discussions in the coming weeks and the months will have to focus on, and we will obviously be very attentive to this. And in the end, we will see whether or not this leads to a proposal for institutional changes with all the risks in terms of ratification. And we know what we are talking about, that this could present. So that's more or less.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you very much also for presenting your views. It was really interesting and very detailed and informative. You're very right that President Macron has been a spiritus agonist basically in the last few years. Those who are working within the academic ivory towers, we thought that was quite an important. That made an important difference, or it should have made even a more important difference, because our impression is that you're right that the European Union, with the Treaty of Lisbon, has weathered through the many crises, and it has come out of it relatively unscathed. But still, the impression is that the status quo in which we are now is more or less unsustainable, and that's something more is needed. So, especially in the academic circles, where we are more critical and even more optimistic and more demanding, we are really looking forward to this conference on the future of Europe with a great degree of expectation. And I wonder now what the European Commission thinks where this might lead us, and what's the European Commission's assessment of the achievements of the Treaty of Lisbon over the last 10 years.
Yes. First of all, also thank you from my side for having included me in this panel. As you said, you're a diplomat and I'm an economist, so basically, but still you're two lawyers here at the same table. So, yeah.
I think it's a great interdisciplinary panel. The only thing that I did wrong this time is the gender. It's not. We don't have a gender balance, right?
It's good. It's good for a change.
Yes.
No, anyway, I wanted to say it's rather timely, the discussion that we have today, not just because the council is taking place today and tomorrow, but also just before I left the office, also the European Parliament President gave us a certain statement calling the member states, the leaders of the member states in the Council to adopt the conclusions that were prepared basically last week at the General Affairs Council. And among these conclusions, it's, at least I felt it between the lines, what he stated, that there is a strong support also of the European Parliament as the institution that of democracy to go into the future of Europe discussion conference and to have the three institutions very much involved with the Parliament, of course, having the leading role. And I don't know if you noticed when you started explaining the Lisbon Treaty per se, that outside there was the European anthem, the bells were ringing. So I would assume we can say it's also timely in that respect that Matej probably also.
It's all arranged by us, don't worry.
Yeah, I know. But what I wanted to say that both of predecessor speakers mentioned crisis, And indeed, the Commission, especially when former President Juncker finished the mandate a couple of weeks ago, among the different speeches that he delivered and the documents that we were also reading, a different representation that the Commission has in all the capitals, like the representation where I work at, is that Europe came out of these several crises, not just the economic and financial one. Basically, there was also the migration crisis. There is also the crisis of having our trade partners, are they still partners or not, and the geopolitical tensions that are happening, that basically Europe did weather this relatively okay. And we are in a position that that the economics, budgets, unemployment, everything stabilized, but of course there is much more to be done. Like you mentioned, the Schengen rules. There was an agreement among the member states, especially during the economic and financial crisis, to consolidate the banking sector, to go into the different rules and more concrete rules as regards that part of our joint, especially the euro area, whereas some other crises, including the migration, did leave some stamps on most of the member states, including the Schengen rules, as you mentioned. But I don't want to go into different rules that are yet to be developed further. It's what you mentioned before, the legal personality the European Union basically got with the Lisbon Treaty, and also the Commission being able to sign international treaties, to negotiate on behalf of the member states. This is something that will contribute to more, to some extent, transparency, but also the efficiency of the member states, and including the Article 50 that was to some extent enabled by the Lisbon Treaty. What is happening now with Brexit, no one wanted, but to some extent this is also one of the crises that occurred during the last 10 years of the Lisbon Treaty, and to some extent, like it was mentioned by Ambassador, it did unite the member states in having the positive benefits that the European Union brings, as regarding them as positive, not something that comes per se, but something that it's worth fighting still together. And if we say that the European Union was basically created on the promise of peace, and that the European Union basically got the Nobel Prize for Peace, it's something that is also worth fighting still together. It's not something that happens just out of the blue. It's what we are, why we are together, and all the values and the fundamental rights. It's yet to be regarded by all the citizens. The citizens are not yet aware of how many rights they have, and this is why perhaps sometimes, especially you lawyers, sometimes they cannot even complain that something is not working well, because they are not yet aware of their rights. But it's something that the Lisbon Treaty, by having this as a part of it, recognized, and it's worth building further on these common values and rights. And having all this together, especially the citizens' initiative that was mentioned as a new form of participatory democracy that came out of the Lisbon Treaty, but even the treaties before enabled the participatory democracy. Since it was formalized, the citizen initiative, some 76 citizen initiatives were basically made public, some 27 under the Juncker Commission, but it's something that the citizens need to be much more aware of, and their participatory democracy doesn't finish only with the European elections, which we are happy that at the last European elections there was a higher turnout. But we would like, and especially with the new push of new European Commissioner, President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, among her 6 priorities, the first one, the European Green Deal, which was the D-Day for us yesterday. I don't know whether you felt it, but at least us, the representation, our Twitter account got basically burned out almost by communicating on the first priority. But the 6th priority of new Commission President is basically new push for democracy. And in this new push for democracy, there are the ideas that were mentioned by Ambassador, that there is basically a compilation of what was collected through the more than 1,800 citizen dialogues that the former Commission had throughout Europe. In Slovenia, we had some 22 citizen dialogues, meaning we opened the floor for the citizens to be more active. And based on this, and based on the 9th of May meeting in Sibiu, where the leaders met at an informal meeting, which then fed into the strategic agenda approved by the Council in June, this is now what new Commission wants to push forward. The concept is not yet known. Today and tomorrow, the leaders will basically give the mandate and will discuss that the three institutions should have an equal say. And what the new president of the Commission wants is that the concept, the whole timeline is basically decided together with the three institutions, and that there would be not just the institutions talking about the European Union's future, but there would be civil society very much included and citizens. And that's the difference between the former citizen dialogues that we organized, that were basically like us sitting here today, that the new future of Europe, the conference, should enable online participatory different ways of citizens having a say, a question, and also much more answers provided actively and in a transparent way. So basically what I'm saying now, that it's ideas. Tomorrow the leaders will give the mandate, and what I read from the European Parliament President Sassoli in this statement that I just printed before coming here from today, is that the Parliament will prepare a certain paper on the 19th of December. And from the tentative agenda of the College of Commissioners, I saw it on the 8th of January. The Commission should prepare a concept paper based on all what I said now. And then the machinery should start. It's set to be for 2 years, so basically from 2020 till 2022. And it's now, this week, so basically also our discussion now, it's timely, that the concept is being prepared. And the initiatives like the French, German on paper, they are very welcome in terms of sending signals what basically the member states want. And it's the Council and the Parliament, the most democratic elected body of the European Union, to give the push. And the new president of the Commission, among the strategic priorities that she listed, this is the 6th one, especially the new push for democracy. She's open even to possible treaty changes. It's just that it remains to be seen if there is a need, if the member states basically want to have it. Already now, how the Lisbon Treaty is prepared, including the passerelle clauses that exist, lots of these things that we are discussing today, or we are yet to discuss, they're basically possible. So I'm not saying that the treaty changes are not possible, it's just it remains to be seen, and at least we can see from what our Commission President is saying that she's open to that. So I would conclude here.
Thank you. Also very good, but let me now, to spice this discussion up a little bit, let me play a devil's advocate for a second. And of course, I agree with everything that has been said here. But still, if we were with a benefit, if we had a benefit of a hindsight in 2000, so that we knew if in 2000 we knew what was going on in 2020, and somebody would have told us that Britain would be opting out, not just from several policies, but it would be actually exiting, that Schengen would be crumbling, that still, it's something that interim exceptions would become, to a certain extent, almost permanent. That we still haven't actually solved the migration crisis. That there has been a major rupture in terms of the very basic values pertaining to the rule of law and democracy between the West and the East. What would people say to that in 2000?
It was French presidency.
Again, I know. But because the problems that we had in 2000, and a few years after, right? We were solving the leftovers of the treaty changes that were taking place before, but still we were really confident that we are on the right track. Today we are, I'm saying, we are still confident that we are doing relatively well, all things considered. But my question is this path still viable within the paradigm that we are in. And the paradigm that we are in, because we don't have any other, there are actually two paradigms that are at our disposal. One is the very cherished paradigm established by Jean Monnet, right? And the Monnet method was about solving concrete issues, making concrete steps, contributing something tangible, and moving one step forward, right? And it was about concrete achievements and establishing concrete solidarity. The other paradigm is the paradigm of international or intergovernmental cooperation. And that one is pretty much visible if you look at that. I think there was a very good initiative by the European Parliament. The debates by the presidents or the leaders of the member states, where they were able to present their views on the future of Europe. The debates were going on for 2 years, and just now a paper was published summarizing those views. And from there, you see that there is a lot of unity about disunity. It's a lot about dragging feet. There's really no real will to make a significant step forward. It's that the Monnet method is simply maybe the minimum common denominator that we can agree to, but it's hard to see how to really do a major step that would mobilize people in really attracting the people's attention to the European Union, and also to shift their hearts and minds and the democratic awareness to the functioning of the European Union as such. And my question is, do you think that we are, in a way, convicted to this in-betweenness between the Monnet method and the intergovernmental methods, and just, in a way, whistling through the concrete challenges? Or will there come a moment in which we will say, well, at a certain point, we will say, we agree to disagree, but certain states will, maybe those around the Eurozone, will simply make a qualitative step forward and will establish maybe even a constitutional union. Who would like to pick up this hot potato?
The lawyer.
The lawyer.
First, about this democratic issue, I think that we are in some sort of a democratic fatigue, not only at the EU level, but also at the level of member states. So it's for me, it's always so difficult to talk about how to enroll in the debate, how to bring citizens closer to the EU, whereas at the same time, at the level of member states, citizens are also further away from its own national institutions. So
right.
I don't think this is a problem of the EU itself. It's a problem of democracy, perhaps, of the time we are living, but not the EU, something which would be strictly connected to the European Union. And if I may, because you started with my your understanding of my point of view, to continue. For instance, you mentioned, and this democratic note, you mentioned the role of the national parliaments, for instance. I haven't mentioned, but they have, with the Lisbon Treaty, some sort of a legal framework which is possible for them to start cooperating in a more tense way with the EU institutions, legislative institutions, in the legislative process. But then when you look at the outcome, you see that this is written down and in reality was really not 100% realized, fulfilled in reality, basically. Then you have the European Citizen Initiative, against something which is written down, it's written nicely, it's written there in order to, again, bring citizens closer to the EU institutions. And it was used in the past many times. But indeed, perhaps you will know the number, I don't know the number by heart, but indeed the successful European Citizens Initiative were few. And what is the bottom line, and this connects with what you said, the lack of awareness or the low awareness of the mechanisms we have. But then again, I'm not sure whether this is the only problem, the problem only with the EU and not only with member states and states itself. Why? Because the citizens adopt these initiatives or are in the process of the initiatives, and then the European Commission says, oh, sorry, this initiative is just not working. Why? Because it's outside of the competences of the European Commission. Not always, but in many cases. And then you said we were together a week ago on a round table talking about the EU Charter, and you said the low awareness of the EU Charter by citizens, based on your...
Based on the Eurobarometer.
Yes. Again, we have this charter. The people can use it. They can use it anytime when they are dealing with EU law. But they lack awareness that it exists and what its rights are and how it can be used. Okay, this is at the EU level, but it's really this lack of knowledge or awareness or the distance between the citizens and the institutions. I think this is not only proper for the EU, but it can be also found in member states.
So what to do with the people? Because the idea of a constitution 10 years or 50 years ago was because the importance of the constitution is to mobilize, right? To constitute, to invoke the people, to bring them to the fore, to give them the voice. And this went against the grain of the old idea of the European Union, which wanted to dispense with the people because the people were, to a certain extent, unreliable and weren't even avoidable. That weren't even at our use at the beginning of the integration process. So.
Yeah, that's why among the different crises the EU faced during the last years, I also mentioned the legitimation crisis. I think treaty is not the point, and maybe EU is also not the point. Member states, it's much broader. I mean, before coming to Slovenia, I was in Canada, which is not an EU member state, and we had exactly the same kind of debates. It's more how to convince the citizens that the different levels of authorities respond to their real problems. So it's something as basic as that, and that's really why the method of involving citizens is absolutely key. And maybe it would not be the miracle solution, but it's key in order to present something that makes sense for citizens. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second, to react on, you mentioned the different circles, so to say. In a sense, it's already more or less the case that in some policies we can have a broader cooperation, that some member states are more intensively engaged in, I don't know, defense policy or things like that. So it's already possible, and it's certainly one way also to have this kind of model EU.
Okay.
What I wanted to also building upon you mentioning, people not feeling close to the institutions or not having enough of knowledge. What we, for example, observed this year when we were working also together in the same building, it's us, the Commission representation, but also the European Parliament Liaison Office, when we were trying to see what can be done before the European elections in order to stimulate people to basically to get interested into the elections. It was, I should not say democratic deficit, but it's why is there lack of interest? Is there something not good? Even though that all the benefits that people know that exist, they take them as granted. So they should be interested in how to involve in, especially the youth, the young generation, because what we are discussing today is basically for their generation, just not for us. The Lisbon Treaty is here, it's more for the others. And what we also think, especially as the Commission representation, that it's something, it's really a pity that we hear, oh, it's a Brussels dictate, oh, Brussels is saying, Brussels is imposing. But why this perception? Basically, Slovenia is sitting also in the council. Slovenia has members of the European Parliament, if I could just say now on Slovenia, I will not go into the French MEPs because there are many more in, but anyway, there are 8 European members of the European Parliament. Slovenia has a say in the Council. So it's not a Brussels dictate, it's basically what was agreed upon, and the Commission is then implementing as the guardian of the treaty. So this perception we are missing, and after 15 years that Slovenia has been member of the European Union, I still think that it's a pity that there is a perception of Brussels dictate. Okay, yes, during the crisis, of course, there were lots of reforms that had to be done, and then it was easier to say, oh, it's because of Brussels we have to do it. And from the Commission perspective, it's fine if they use this term, because if the reform is done, we are happy. But it's a pity. It should not be regarded. It should not be regarded as an external policy, basically. It's the internal policy. And why, in some cases, not just Slovenia, some other member states including, they are treating EU affairs as not really included in the capital, but more as an external. It should not be regarded like this. And saying it's only Brussels, basically, yes, in Brussels decisions are taking place, but it's based on different positions from the member states, from the capitals coming. And there I think it's not just the role of the institutions, but it's also the role of education system. It's not just the universities, even earlier, to have the perception of the common European flag, of having the perception it's a common EU market. It should be exploited. It's all the freedoms that are enabled, and it's not yet in the gist of people. It's not yet in education system. It should come perhaps earlier, not just the universities, not just those that are convinced that they study European law. It should come earlier. Basic rights, human rights, like we discussed last week at the round table. I have the right to live. I have the right to be forgotten. This type of, even a child would understand them, but I think it's coming too late. Mm-hmm. I don't want to be critical, but we felt it. It's not fair to be called just, it's a Brussels dictate. But sometimes when, for example, this morning, if I can give an example, this morning we had a discussion in the European House in Ljubljana on the recent report that the Commission prepared together with the OECD on health matters. And there were some questions coming from the public, as if us, the Commission, would give a recipe to Slovenia how to have the health system in place. No, it's not us to decide. We are just giving the picture. We analyzed. It's the analysis that we are providing to the authorities, but it's them to decide. And this is why it should not be treated as a Brussels dictate. You have all the tools we are providing. Even if I give another example, the European semester example, we are doing the analysis, but then it's up to the member states to follow the recommendations which are agreed in the council among each other. So I would say it's double fault of the institutions. Perhaps we need to come even closer. Perhaps the citizen dialogues were not enough, even if they were 1,800. Perhaps now, if it's more e-based consultations, that it comes closer to the youth, it might. I hope it will work a bit better. But on the other hand, it's also the fault in the member states. All this awareness that I'm trying to preach now, that it needs to be a more awareness raising, and coming more into the people's mind. It's the common market, it's the common EU history, common continent, and let's share it together. If I was a bit clear now.
Sure. Now I'd like to share the panel with you. Who would like to ask a question? Lily, please.
Yeah, I would like to ask you, what do you think it should be done to do something about what you just mentioned before? Do we do what? There isn't enough information? Include something in the primary school or the secondary school? Actually, we don't do enough. Do you have any ideas what to do to change everything?
Meaning, ideally, some topics would be also included in curricula. Not just EU topics, even the citizen rights topics, to start a bit earlier, if I can say.
What else? Like, in the newspapers, we don't have any serious debate about these topics. We just have kind of like a yellow news. And nobody's, people just don't like to read tough things.
Yeah.
We should do more, I guess.
we are trying, but perhaps we are not followed yet enough. We are perhaps not heard enough, which we would like to do.
That's exactly the kind of debate we had after the negative referendum in France. And when we made the list of what already exists, there is a lot of information, there are a lot of possibilities to be informed. So it's maybe changed the paradigm. I agree with you that it should be tackled earlier in the lifetime, because when you are already an adult and reading a kind of press, you will not read the articles in Europe because you are not interested. So it's not easy at all, and we have been dealing with that for.
Yeah, but like, you know, I don't know, you probably all remember what happened in the period before we joined the European Union and NATO. At that time, you know, let's say Slovenia, the whole country was organized and mobilized to do something about it, and they had round tables and they were on TV and they were constantly talking about these topics, and today it's just nothing.
Yeah, because when you are an EU member, everything is taken for granted. I mean, free movement, euro, things like that. It's felt as normal. I mean, at least in France, but I suppose in Slovenia too.
Any other question? Yes, please.
I would like to ask, because the Lisbon Treaty brought also the European External Action Service and the High Representative for Foreign Policy. And on the Black Strategy Forum, we heard from Mr. Borrell, from my point of view, a very crucial sentence, that the EU should start to formulate its own foreign policy interests and to pursue them on the international level. And if we look on the contemporary international issues, I mean outside the European Union, including Crimea, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, Libya, Sub-Saharan Africa, South China Sea, and many, many others, that the European Union, from some critical point of view, failed to play a crucial role to represent the European interests. We have seen that, for example, in Ukraine or in Syria, that the European Union had a problem to formulate a clear, unified stance on this issue and to pursue this interest and to be heard on the same level as the United States, Russia, or China. Because if we look on the number of citizens in the European Union, and if we look on the level of wealth of the states that are unified in the European Union, the Europe represents a global superpower. But it, I believe, from my point of view, has shortcomings in pursuing a coherent foreign policy that would be relevant on the world stage. So I would like to ask you if you think that there is, I would say, steps to be done, to be made, what should be improved in order to enhance the relevance of the EU in the international arena?
That's a very good question, and also a very timely one, because just recently we heard from Brussels, and there was also a response by the Slovenian Minister of Foreign Affairs. What was on the table was sort of an informal examination which member states are in favor of introducing majority voting, also in the field of external policy. And I believe I heard that the official position of Slovenia was that we're absolutely against that. And I think it's in the unanimity requirement that explains why the common denominator makes the European Union so weak and feeble in relationship to the external affairs. But what do you think, Madam Ambassador?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and we will see how Mr. Borrell succeeds in this. I mean, it's certainly in our common interest to have the most convergent view, but we also have to be realistic in the sense that since it's still an unanimity process, and since the member states have different histories, different geographical positions, they have different point of views on the different crises. So let's use the added value of every member state in order to have the best common interest at the end of the day. And we are quite confident that Mr. Borrell will do a good job, including in the Western Balkans with the special envoy he mentioned.
Right. Sure.
Can I add something? I agree with you. This is the bottom line. But then just sort of like an example of an area where the European Union, I think, has a lot of possibilities, and to an extent it's already using them, but because we agree, not 100%, and perhaps it should be more coherent. This is the area of restrictive measures, for instance, because the Union, with this instrument, with this external action tool, it's actually sort of like overstepping the deficiencies of the UN, because the Security Council is unable to adopt sanctions against certain states, whereas the European Union can. Of course, this is just, you know, like a small introduction, I would like to say, because we agree it lacks coherency, it lacks common interest, it lacks speaking with one voice. But this is an area where the European Union, in terms of external action, it could mean an added value in globalized world, in international relations. So this is an area where, as an international organization, you will not be happy, but I will use this sentence, the European Union as an international organization can have an added value in international relations. Of course, it would be better if it would be coherent, speaking with what voice, one interest, not 28 interests, and so on. But this is something where I think it could be a role model in international relations of adopting these measures towards the states which sort of like lack the rule of law, democracy, and so on, or are.
I just wanted to add that the new president also firmly stated in summer and also now the last 2 weeks about the geopolitical commission and also the geopolitical union, and this is also for the EU to play a more active and more global role, given that the powers that basically it has. And then she stated that European leadership means working hand in hand with our neighbors and also our partners. And among what you stressed before, speaking about the qualified majority voting, the proposal, basically in her strategic priorities, she stressed that she will basically fight for the qualified majority voting, because this would enable the Europe to be a global leader, and it needs to act fast. And this is the logic behind. But of course now it's up to the member states, to decide where they want to go.
Yes, please.
Thank you, and thank you for this evening. It's been really interesting. It's an important discussion. I'm the Ambassador of Ireland, and I'm just reflecting on your observation of what a person in 2000 might think if they were looking ahead today. But that's perhaps a little bit unfair. What we really should have is a panoramic view of from 2000 to today, where you know, we had the logistical challenge of introducing the euro. I recall, you know, people said that's impossible. It's, you know, it's a great idea, but it'll never really work, because just even on the, you know, the economic level there's a question mark. Even just the logistics of actually introducing a whole new currency. Also in 2000, we still hadn't got the enlargement to the east. There was still at that stage even question marks about some of those, whether those countries, one or two, would be actually ready to join. That has taken place. It's been successful with all the challenges involved. We had a war in the Middle East that introduced challenges to our external approach to Europe. We've had and following on from that directly then with the migration crisis, which was each one of these has, you know, people on the sidelines questioned whether this would actually fundamentally weaken or even end the European Union. And then most recently we've had this Brexit crisis, and there's very few positives in that, but it's one of the positives is that, you know, there's been a solid united approach by the European Union in relation to the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union. And it strikes me from the discussion that, you know, the European Union strives to be perfect, which of course it should, but it's probably one of the unique international institutions or bodies or political entities that is held to a benchmark of perfection. You know, anything short of that is almost a disaster. And I don't think any other organisation or political structure is held to the same level as the European Union. And I suppose the greatest compliment we have is that actually other countries still want to join us. And we really should start worrying if they don't want to join. And you know, so there's a lot of positives that we really should reflect on. And I think even the questioning of why the European Union should be actually brought in to solve what is a national issue in terms of legitimacy. It's because the European Union has done this throughout, you know, the European Union and the earlier European community, you know, successfully challenged, you know, conflict in Europe. So it's always called in to tackle the big question. So it's entirely unfair to some extent, but it's been a great success story to date.
That's a very good point. So maybe our expectations have also been just too high, and since the expectations are too high, whenever we don't meet them, there is a crisis, right? But one issue I just like to bring in on the table before we say goodbye is the treaty is of course a text, and a text is important, but to breathe the life into the text, and this also fits into the question of qualified majority voting, is of course the issue of trust. What do you think has happened over the last 10 years in terms of trust between the member states and the member states versus the institutions? Because that is important. I think that's sort of a glue which binds the system together and makes it viable.
Perhaps one trend that perhaps in 2000 no one actually thought would exist, if I can be so blunt, is basically fake news and digital technologies. And this, at least in the last 2 years, we've felt there is an impact on sending perhaps wrong messages and causing directly lack of trust, and also harming trust into institutions. Before the European elections, there was some extra, let's say, think tanks within different institutions that try to tackle this. And even now, daily we get an email, a special email with a collection of fake news from the day before. So I felt that this is now causing, because it's different social skills that people have in different electronic media, that it goes with such a super fast speed that has caused tremendous effect in negative sense. That would be something that no one thought in 2000, and that especially in the last 2 years we see it as devastating. And of course, whatever we react, even if we write it immediately via different channels of communication that we have, the damage is there. And this is difficult then to rebuild trust. But as I said, perhaps I would come back to the same notion that trust is being built from the early childhood on. And if there is a notion of trust in such an early age, it would be kept. It's difficult to reconvince someone who has already his or her opinion about the union where he lives in. So perhaps that would be one of the recent effects that I would like to point out.
I agree. I mean, on trust, mainly towards the institution, the fake news point is certainly a key. And it's true, as I mentioned earlier on, for EU institutions, but also for national institutions and others. The trust between member states is a bit more difficult. I mean, the main different objective one between 2000 and today is that we are more numerous, more diverse, with, as I mentioned, also different histories and background. So it's more challenging to have a common position and to understand each other. And that's also the very positive and interesting thing in a larger EU. I experienced it when I was in Brussels. At some point, I had 10 new comrades around me in the working groups, and it was more difficult but much more interesting. And especially at that time, I was dealing with Eastern Europe, so having all the new member states, so-called, was really a plus, I would say, in this specific group. But it's also challenging then to trust. It's challenging for Polish colleague to trust France when it comes to Russia, for instance. Or it's difficult for us to trust an Estonian when it comes to Africa. And it's so that's one of the aspects. And for that, in order to have this common trust, we really have to work, and it's a daily work on common values, common project, and this is a long-term process which is really worthwhile working on.
Okay. Igor also raised his hand.
Thank you, Matej. I do think that trust is of tremendous importance, having in mind especially the several crises that we went through and the consequences of these crises, which are still here, be it in a material sense or non-material senses. Let's say Ukrainian crisis left a deep feeling of uncertainty and vulnerability on the eastern flank of the EU. But there is as well something as regards how do leaders communicate about the EU when they speak in public, when they, for example, come back home from Brussels. These demonizing I think is one big obstacle as regards building trust and the feeling of being connected of an ordinary citizen to the EU, which should be seen as ours. We are part of it. And when speaking about the conference, I do think that there is one element that should not be left missing or unmentioned, and it is, speaking about democracy, the basic form of democracy, fundamental form that we have is representative democracy. And here, I do think that national parliaments are not involved enough in the European affairs. I think this is a kind of a missing link. Mentally and concretely, since it is those who are going to working groups and especially to councils and European councils, they should be held to accountable, really. And they should be much more present with this agenda in national parliaments. This is one thing, and the other is, of course, is the trust between member states. I do think this is something extremely difficult to build and extremely easy to dismantle, since it is connected in a certain way with, let's say, collective empathy, because at the end of the day, your pain should be mine as well. I should feel your pain. It is, for example, what NATO did with its forward presence on the eastern flank. But within the EU, we have so many different dossiers where probably we don't have inclusive enough deliberations. And this then builds on, slowly, very slowly. I do remember when we, during Slovenian presidency, one of our jobs was to make the Lisbon Treaty implementable. But since there was some very important sensitivity in some member states, we said, okay, it will be low radar, we'll deal with it only at the coreper level, and mostly off the record, off the radio screen of media. And then when we tried to make the final report for the European Council, during drafting the final report, we just been learning about the very likely result in Ireland as regards the referendum. And I was at that time really able to see to which extent it affected all the colleagues at Coreper. Everyone really felt that, okay, this is really sensitive. And we should pay attention not to have any kind of accusatory or triumphalistic expressions in media and so on. And I do think that we are, generally speaking, not careful enough. And our leaders are not careful enough when they speak to the public about the EU.
Okay.
It should be much more inclusive in their minds.
Okay, thank you.
But can I just one sentence? But again, that proves that the legal basis, the treaties, are okay.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
they offer this,
Indeed.
the possibility of deeper involvement and
Yes.
so on.
I
So
agree.
It's just a matter what they say in front of the council building in Brussels and what they say for the national press in front of the national parliaments. But I would also very much stress what you said, that for the conference on the future of Europe, there is supposed to be much more active national parliaments, at least what's expected also from the Commission perspective. And if I can say the final point as regards trust, years ago no one would thought that the traditional partners that the European Union had would perhaps not be partners anymore, and this is also causing some trust as regards the geopolitical situation, and even in it might not be directly linked, but it's linked to some extent in the forecast of the economic growth. What is now causing some instability is unpredictability, and this is because of lack of trust among the traditional partners, unfortunately.
Just let's see how slow we are in implementing the banking union. What we promised when the idea
During
has
the
been
crisis,
born, and
yeah.
years.
it is due to the lack of trust. And of course, there are different interests. And there is, I mean, the veil of ignorance has been lifted. We know who would be able to profit in short term, and we are so short-termistic more and more when assessing. And then we turn the whole game into a zero-sum game.
Yeah, unfortunately, even though the EU is based on solidarity. Yeah.
Okay.
Where trust got us.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, to my invitees, to my speakers. I really enjoyed what you've said. We agreed mostly about everything. I tried to be a little bit the devil's advocate, but it didn't work. Still, I believe also Katerina stole my last line. I want to stress that indeed it has turned out after 10 years that the Treaty of Lisbon still provides for a very viable, very lively, flexible enough text. I don't think that we should really run into the treaty change. What seems to be more important is to build a political context around it. And I do lay my trust in the future conference on the future of Europe, that this will also have, that this won't be just a debate for its own sake and for those who are already convinced, as we are to a certain extent, but that it will initiate something more and something deeper that will provide for a new momentum for the European Union and to get out of it some fresh ideas, fresh concepts which will provide new stimulus for the future. I thank you very much for your attention, for your visit. I also wish you very nice holidays that are in front of us. There is some Christmas feel already outside. It will disappear in 2 days when the warm front is coming.
One night.
So enjoy it as long as it lasts. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.